Just one moment. Taking a second. Here we go. Okay. Just one moment. We are live now. So welcome everyone to our Lunch Learn. It's great to see you, and I'm excited to study with you. Today's topic, I should say, is on Lecha, and in particular, the topic is leadership starts at home. So let me share my screen with you. If you can figure out how to do that, here we go. Well, before I even jump in and share my screen with you, let's talk just in general about leadership. So when it comes to leadership, what are some of the most important traits of a leader? If I had to ask you to name me the top 5 most important traits of a leader, what would you say?
Inspirational.
Inspirational, okay. So they have to inspire the masses, okay. Can you be a leader? Lead by example, good. What else?
Confidence.
Confidence. Can you be a leader without followers?
Sure.
How can you be a leader without followers?
Well, that's the same. You can lead by example if you don't have followers. Like people you might not even know can see your example by the things you might do in public, and they would be like your followers. You might not even know it.
Okay. Now, if I were to ask you, so based on some of these descriptions you're using, so let's say this week's Parsha will be introduced to Abraham. So let's take the first 3 major characters in the Torah: Adam, Noah, Abraham. How would you rank them in terms of their greatness and then their leadership? Who's number 1? Who's your top guy? Who are you taking with the number 1 pick in the fantasy draft?
That would be Abraham.
Okay, Paul says Abraham. Why would you go with Abraham?
Well, I mean, he was obviously the most successful as far as God spoke to him and God promised him and God did for him. It's his family that we follow, the whole story.
Okay, so you're saying that the nation comes from him, we come from him, all religion really come from him. Does anyone disagree with Paul? What would be a case to make for Noah?
You might say Noah because he was able to get people to go on the boat with him. But really, that was his family. They, if your family doesn't believe you, then really, where are you at all? in that case,
Right, that's true. We're going to talk more about Noah and how much convincing he does of others, but God recreates the world with Noah. Think about that for a second. When God recreates the world, he doesn't wait till an Avram to recreate the world. He recreates it with Noah. He literally says, Noah, you're going to be my new Adam. Every single human being is going to come from you and your children. Every single person comes and ties their life back to Noah. And what's even more remarkable is we read this last week. I'm going to share my screen with you. Here we go. Let's see if that works. We read, look at the attributes, the way that he's described. Ele toldot Noach, beginning of Parshat Noach. Noach ish tzaddik. Noach is a righteous man. Tamim haya bedorotav. He was blameless. He was pure within his generations. Et ha'elohim hitalech Noach. Noach literally walked with God. And I want you to know there isn't a single character in all of Tanakh, in the entire corpus of the Bible, there is nobody who is described with such attributes. There is no one who's described as a tzaddik, number 1. Not a single person who's described as being quote unquote righteous in the way that Noach is. There's nobody who is described as being tamim, as being pure the way that he is, except for Job, who is described in a similar way. And in addition to that, there is nobody who's described as walking with God except for Abraham, who walks in a different way with God. But when we talk about Abraham walking with God, he's not described as pure. So this Noah character is described as like not just the greatest of his generation, he's described as really one of the most remarkable human beings in all time. And yet,
but isn't that saying he's the greatest in his generation kind of put a qualification on it?
Oh, so excellent.
He wouldn't be so great in any other generation.
Excellent. So Paul could have written Rashi's commentary for him.
I did.
He did, right? If you look really carefully, it says written by Paul Katz in this fine print. So Paul is hitting on a very, very important Rashi. Rashi says, why does the Torah tell us Bidorotav, that he was righteous in his age, in his time period, in his generations? So Rashi says as follows, quoting the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Yesh mirabotenu dorshimo toleshavach. Some people expand upon this word in his generation as a positive to mean what? He was righteous even in his generation. There wasn't a single good person in his generation, and yet he still was righteous. Kol shekain ilu haya b'dor tzadikim hayat tzadik yoter. All the more so, if he would have lived in a generation of Abrahams or Isaacs or Jacobs or whoever, he would have been even more righteous. So some people see this word the opposite of what Paul's saying, but others see it the way that Paul suggests. V'yesh shador shemoto l'gnai. Some say that it's a negative. Lefi doro hayat tzadik. He was only righteous relative to his generation. Vilu haya b'doro shel Avram, but if he would have been living at the time of Abraham, lo haya nechshav l'klum. He would have been a nobody. Nobody would have even known anything about him. And Rashi continues and gives a proof. Et ha'elohim yitalech Noach. What's the proof? We see that Noach walks with God, but how is it referred to with Avram? Avram hu omer asher hitalachti lefanav. In the case of Avram, the Torah tells us later in chapter 24, the God before whom I walk. Noach, we see, hayat tzarech tzad l'tamcho. He had God's support to uphold him in righteousness. Avram hayat mitchazek u'malech b'tzidko me'elav. Avram drew his own strength from himself and walked in his righteousness by himself. Whereas we see he had to walk with him, like the way I would hold my son's hand or something when we're walking outside. So we see that there is this idea that maybe compared to Abraham, Noach is simply not that righteous. Now, this comparison between Noach and Abraham makes a lot of sense to make that comparison. What are some similarities or some differences, or why is it natural to think about comparing these two specific people? Notice there are actually better comparisons. I spoke about this in my video before Shabbat last week, that I think a strong comparison can be made between Noach and Moshe in the way that the Torah describes them. But what is it about Avram in particular that makes Noach the perfect foil or comparison? What makes them similar?
I think one of the big differences is Abraham questions God. Why are you killing these cities? What if there's no, I don't think Noah did that.
So good. Perhaps the most famous comparison is that when God is going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Amorah, he comes and says, I can't hide anything from Abraham. And he talks to Abraham about his plans to do what he's going to do, which is destroy the city. And we know the very famous story that Abraham begs. He says, let there be 50, if there are 50 righteous people, spare the city. And God says, sure, and he can't find it. 40 righteous people, let there be just 10 righteous people. And he can't. He's begging, he's negotiating with God, trying to save the city. And he can't do it. He's not successful. On the other hand, what's the story with Noach? How many people did he save with him on the ark?
Just his family.
Just his family. Nobody he saved. So you can make an argument that they both were in positions where they could influence the people around them, and yet they didn't. I want to come back to that, though, in just a moment, because I think there's even more basic, before we analyze those two stories, there's even something more basic. In the Torah records that there's exactly 10 generations between Adam and Noach, and 10 generations between Noach and Abraham. So there's a special relationship that they both have with God as being the only people that God speaks to after exactly 10 generations. That's not a chance. But it's more than that. If we analyze their lives, and again, we look at the Midrash in particular to understand it, we'll actually see a few different things. When in our Parshat Lecha, what is Avraham doing? He is literally coming. Avraham comes to a new land with new people. So he is an outsider to the people. When it comes to Noach, who is Noach? Noach has the opposite relationship. He's one of the people. He didn't grow up outside of the generation of the flood. He was literally part and parcel of that generation. He just happened to be righteous, maybe relative to his generation, but he was just different than everybody else. Noach isolates himself from the masses. On the other hand, Abraham goes out, and what does Abraham do? He goes and he tries to recruit people. One of the things we spoke about in our lunch and learn a few years back was that he specifically encamps in locations that are equidistant to different places to set up shop to proselytize and bring people closer to God. Noach, what does he do? God tells him to build an ark and isolate himself. And so there are many underlying similarities and differences between them, which makes them an interesting comparison. And so the question we have to then ask is, so what does Noach lack that Avram actually has? If we want to suggest, according to this opinion in Rashi, what is it that he has that makes him less so, that the rabbis would even have a hava amina, they would even have a thought to suggest that Noach's on a lower level. So what Paul is suggesting is that, yes, there is, let me share with you over here, this Rashi. So Rashi over here tells us, Aseh lecha tevat atzei gofer, make for yourself a teva. Harbe ravach v'atzala lefanav. So there are numerous ways by which God could have saved Noach. Why did he make him build an ark? I mean, it's a good question. I mean, God creates the world by snapping his fingers. So why does he have to do it in this way? Why can't God just save him? Why can't he just, have everything destroyed around him instead of having to go into an ark? Why does he have to do it like this? And he's got to work on this for years. Why? So the Medrash says that he was working for 120 years on this ark. That's a long project. If you think the construction on the highway is taking a long time, 120 years to build an ark. And people were just asking him, what are you doing? And the thought was, what is it that God wanted him to do? He wanted him to get people to change their minds. He wanted them to do tshuva, to repent. And that's why he has him build this crazy ark to save humanity, because he wanted him to give him a chance to do it. And yet we know that he's not successful in this, right? He's not able to do this. In fact, the Al-Sheikh says, look at the language here. God tells him, Aseh lecha tevat atzei, make for yourself a teva. The Al-Sheikh says, the word lecha, make for thee, make for yourself an ark. The Al-Sheikh says that this phrase for yourself was purposely put there because Noach only had any intention of saving himself. He had no intention of really saving anybody beyond his own family. He never was going to do it. Now, he had no intention of helping people grow or be better. Compare that for a second to Avram in our Parshat. Notice the same language here. Vayomer Hashem Avram, Lech Lecha, go, Lecha, to you, for you. Again, I say Lecha Teva, make for you an ark. Here is similar language, Lecha, to you, for you, I should say. And you should go from Me'artzecha, Mimoladizecha, Mibeit Avicha, Etzashareka, go from your native land, from your father's house, the land that I will show you. By Kach Avraham, later, 4 verses later, what does Avram do? He takes with him Sarai, Ishto. He takes his wife Sarah. He takes Lot ben Achiv, his nephew Lot, Bekol Rechusham, and all the wealth they had amassed, Asher Rachashu. And in addition, Et HaNefesh Asher Asu Becharan. And he also takes with him what? The Nefesh, the persons that he acquired in Haran. Who are the persons that he acquired in Haran? What does that mean?
His followers.
Exactly right. So we can, one way, the simple way to read it is that he owned people, slaves. But more probably he was taking with him his followers. And who are his followers? So Rashi tells us, again, based on Midrash, that Avram would convert and proselytize the men, Sarah to the woman. And that's what happened. He literally brought people closer to God, which is the opposite of what Noach does. And so you may want to make an argument that Abraham is simply on a higher level than Noach because he actually does work. He brings more people closer to God. But the Zohar has a different interpretation. The Zohar explains Noach's behavior, and he suggests that Noach was actually afraid that if he prayed for his generation, that he himself would not be spared. What does that mean? How do you understand that? The Zohar says, if Noach would have davened for his generation, he was worried that he would not have been spared. What is his worry?
He wanted to separate himself from everybody else. He doesn't want, Hashem to believe that he was one of the crowd. He wanted to separate himself so he would be viewed by himself rather than with everyone else.
Right. So what you're saying here, really, I'm just going to sharpen what you're saying, is that when you pray for somebody, you have to understand where they're coming from. You have to get them. You have, right? You can't just pray for someone that you don't relate to, that you can't understand them. So in order for Noach to understand them, he would have to kind of metaphorically get in the pit with them. He was going to have to better understand these people if he was going to pray for them. And when you do that and you get closer to those people, as you start to be sympathetic to them, what might happen? Well, you yourself might start to change. You yourself might become influenced by that generation. And so the Zohar says that when we talk about Noach not davening or not converting people the way that Abraham does, he builds the ark for 120 years, don't be so tough on the guy. He's living as the single person in an entire world that is decent, that has any values, any ethics, any morals, right? When it comes to Abraham praying for Stone, so why does Abraham pray for Stone? You want to say, well, Abraham, did he know people from Stone? Yeah, he did understand what they stood for. Remember, his nephew Lot was living in Stone. He understood their values, and it didn't corrupt him. Noach was worried about praying for them lest he become corrupted. So then if Abraham really is in fact greater than Noach, we have to ask the question of why. What is it about him that makes him greater? And so perhaps to do that, we have to look into Abraham's life and understand who he was. Now there's something that's actually missing from the Torah, which is what happened when Abraham was a young kid. Remember, if we're talking about Yitzchak and Yaakov, we hear their entire story from birth through death. We see how they grow up. We see the mistakes that make. We see the mistakes Yaakov makes as a child. We see Yosef, his mistakes as a child with his brothers. But yet we know nothing about Abraham's life growing up. And so the Midrash comes and actually fills in the gaps. This, what I'm going to share with you, you might be familiar with. You probably are familiar with it. But it actually doesn't come anywhere in the text. So take a look here in box number 5. I'm going to read it in English just because it's faster. So we see that Haran died in the presence of his father Terach. So Rabbi Chia said, Terach was actually a manufacturer of idols. He once went away somewhere and left Avram to sell them in his place. A man came in and wished to buy one of them. How old are you? Avram asked the man. 50 years old, he said. Woe to such a man who is 50 years old and would worship a day-old object, meaning it was just recently fashioned. Avram said, on another occasion, a woman came in with a plate full of flour and requested him, take this and offer it to them. So he took a stick and broke them, put the stick in the hand of the largest idol. And when his father returned, he demanded, what have you done to them? I can't conceal it from you. A woman came with a plate full of beautiful, fine flour meal and requested me to offer it to them. One of the idols said, I need to eat it first. Another says, I need to eat it first. And Avram tells his father, there was a big fight. The largest one arose, took the stick and broke them. And so Terach says, why are you teasing me? Why are you making sport of me? Have they any knowledge, Terach says? Should not your ears hear what your mouth has said, Avram said. Avram is trying to tell his father, you realize how silly you sound, right? You worship them, but yet you don't believe that they have power. And so who steps forward? Terach seizes him and delivers him to Nimrod. Let us worship fire, Nimrod said. Let us rather worship water, which quenches fire, Avram said. Let us worship water, Nimrod says. Let us rather worship the clouds, which bear the water, Avram says, right? So Nimrod said, fine, let's worship the clouds. Let's worship the winds, which disperse the clouds, and so on and so forth. And so they're fighting back and forth. And so eventually what happens? He tells him, Nimrod, this is a story where Nimrod says to him, I'm going to throw you into the fiery furnace. Haran hears this debate between Nimrod and Avram about whether or not God really is the all-powerful being that we know he is. Haran was standing there undecided. And he said, if Avram is victorious, I will say that I am of Avram's belief. While if Nimrod is victorious, I'll say I'm on Nimrod's side, he thought. And when Avram descended into the fiery furnace and was saved, Nimrod asked him, of whose belief are you? And so when he saw he was saved, all of a sudden Haran says, I'm of Abraham's. And he replied, thereupon he seized him and cast him into the fire. His innards were scorched and died in the presence of his father. And that's why it says Haran died in the presence of his father Terach. So what do we learn about Avram from the story? What are some takeaways? He's not afraid to stand up for what he believes in, according to the story, right? Even to Nimrod, the king of the world at that time. He has enough faith that he's willing to go into a fiery furnace for God. I mean, these are great leadership qualities. But what's the question that we would ask after we read this story? Why does the Torah not tell us the story? Why do we not make any mention of it whatsoever? if how he found God is so important, and this is like this amazing story, why would we not include it in the Torah? What do you think? Why would we not include the story like this in the Torah, which is how Abraham showed faith, found God? Wouldn't that be the blueprint for all of us on how we can find God too? If Abraham is Av Hamon Goyim, if he is the father of all nations, well, okay, so let's follow his blueprint. How do you find God? When you're lost, when we're struggling in a dark world like we are now, trying to find faith and have faith, shouldn't we literally look to see how Abraham found faith? Why do we not make mention of it at all? What do you think? Take a look here for a moment at Rav Soloveitchik in a great book actually asks this question. He says, the story of Avram's early years, how he found God, is not recorded in the Bible. We would have liked the Chumash to tell us about his sleepless nights when he was struggling with himself, when he began to rebel against pagan society, when he left that society. But we know nothing about him until a mature age. So what is it? Why don't we say anything? So I think there's a few possible answers that we can suggest. I want to share with you three possibilities. One is by the Ramban. Ramban says that the Torah actually does not list how he found God, because we don't want to give voice to any philosophical arguments or any religious fighting that were part of Abraham's formative years. In other words, the Torah doesn't want to record the back and forth and give other credence to other ideas. We just want to say that Abraham found God. That's one possibility. I think it's an okay possibility, not as strong as some others. Rav Yoel Ben Nun develops a different idea, which is that if the Torah would have told us why Abraham was chosen by giving us these earlier years story, so it would appear that when God chose Abraham, it was because of something very specific. So, for instance, imagine if the Torah would have told us the story of the Kivshan Ha'esh, where he goes in the furnace of fire. What would you expect to happen when people were looking for faith?
Want to go in the fire.
People would jump into fires, right? Because they would say, oh, this is the reason why Abram was chosen. So in order to show faith, we need to do the same thing. And that's what people would do. And so rather, Abram isn't selected because of one moment of his childhood, but Rav Yoel Ben Nun argues he's constantly being selected over and over again based on his actions and what he does. In other words, when he has his 10 trials, all the stories of Breshit are all part of an ongoing selection process that makes him to be the leader that we know he will be. And a third possibility, and then I want to hear your thoughts and feedback, is from the Maharal in his Netzach Yisrael. He writes differently. He says that God selects Abraham, not similar to this previous idea, not because of any specific character trait. If it would have been for because he was righteous or because he did something, so then the implication would be that if we were not righteous or we weren't living up to that character trait, then we would no longer be the chosen people. But the Maharal says it doesn't matter how we act. The fact the Torah doesn't tell us why Avram was chosen, why the Torah doesn't give us all the details of how he was growing up or anything like that, that is the proof that we are chosen no matter what we do. We could be people who don't do Torah and mitzvos, who don't study Torah and perform God's commandments. We could be terrible people. We would still be the chosen people. And there's no action that can take that away from us. And that's the reason why the Torah doesn't give us the details about Abraham's life. Questions or thoughts before we just take this a step further? So we have some idea here as to why the Torah is not including all the details of Avram's life, and some idea as to how he was relative to Noah. But yet we do know one thing that is a little bit strange. Take a look at this. Where does Abraham's journey actually begin? It doesn't begin in our Parsha. Remember, just up here, I showed you Lech Lecha. Where was it? Right, Vayomer Hashem Avram, God comes to Avram and says, Lech Lecha mi'artzecha. Leave your land from your father's house, the land I will show you. That's actually not where we first find Abraham. We find him at the end of last week's Parsha, Parshat Noach. Vayamad Haran al pnei terach aviv, pasuk kafchet, verse 28, that Haran dies in his father's face, just like we saw the Medrash filled in the blanks. And Be'eretz Ma'ato Be'or Kastim, the land of Or Kastim, in that place. Vaikach Avram Nachor Lahem Nashim, they all take wives. Next verse, Vadi Sarai Akara in Lavalad. Sarah doesn't have any children, can't have children. And then the next verse 31. Vaikach Terach et Avram beno. Terach takes Avram his son, and Lot ben Haran ben Beno, and his grandson Lot, because his father is now dead. That Sarai Kawato and Sarah, Eshet Avram beno. They take Sarah with, and Terach takes them. Vayetzu itam me'or kastim. They all leave Ur Kasdim. Lech et Artz Canaan vayavo ad Haran vayeshu sham. They go to Haran, and they reside there. Vayihiyu yimei Terach chamesh shanim matayim shana vayamat Terach beCharan. And Terach dies in Haran many years later, but we put it here to finish up the story. So what's the question that we asked at the end of last week's Parsha? The whole big story of Abraham is that he is tested. Go to the land that I will show you. What was happening right before God tells him to do that? He's already on the way. His father took him already on the way. He's literally going. So the question is, in the end of last week's Parsha, they leave Ur Kasdim, they go to a place called Haran. They're already on their way to the Holy Land. So you mean to tell me that Avram is this great righteous person because he listens and follows blindly to God to go to a land he won't know? Well, guess what? By Terach Aviv, Terach, his father, takes him. This was already. That's like saying, I want you to come to Shul. Do me a favor, come to Shul, and you're already on your way to Shul. You're already on your way. You don't get extra points for doing me a favor for coming to Shul. You're already on your way to drop something off. And so this is a very famous machloket between the Ibn Ezra and the Ramban. The Ibn Ezra, in fact, shares. Oopsies, let me share my screen again. The Ibn Ezra suggests that this command of Lech Lecha already was commanded to Avram when they were still living in Ur Kasdim. In other words, over here, right over here, before they leave, is when the words from our Parsha, Lech Lecha, take place. That's what the Ibn Ezra says. It's taken out of order, right? So what happens? God had already commanded Avram when they were still in Ur Kasdim to leave his land and country and birthplace in the house of his father. And the reason is that God knew that Terach, after he went to go to the land of Canaan, would stay in Haran, right? He knew he wasn't going to continue. And so it's not a big deal that Terach came along for the journey, but the command to go already was in the past. The Ramban famously has a different interpretation. And for the sake of time, we're not going to read it inside, but the Ramban disputes this understanding. And he asks, well, why would this not be recorded, right? If it should have been before that the command came, it should have been recorded there. So he argues that Terach left not because he was coming along with Avram, rather he was coming for personal reasons. And when Haran turns out to be a great place and a welcome place to stop, so he chooses to stay there rather than to continue forward. And then he stays there, and then Avram is told to come the rest of the way. But Terach was traveling not because he was following along with his son, rather because he thought that this was a good place to travel to. Now, and there are proofs, by the way, both ways for this. Like, for example, the proof to Ibn Ezra's opinion is, "Vayomer elav ani Hashem asher tzeticha me'or kasdim." God says to Avram, "I took you out of Ur Kasdim, not Haran over here where Terach was, from Ur Kasdim in particular." So that's one potential proof. And so Soloveitchik in this book, Abraham's Journey, he actually, and I just took pieces of it here and there. He does an incredible job of tying both the Ibn Ezra and the Ramban's opinion and kind of putting them together. And by doing so, I think gives us a much deeper insight into what makes Abraham truly one of the greatest Jewish leaders, and certainly more righteous than Noach and more fitting to be the father of our nation. The Ibn Ezra says that Terach went in response to the divine command that Avram received from God. Now, if we accept this interpretation, we can solve another riddle. Our sages stated that Terach repented and embraced the new faith his son was preaching. But what we miss in the story of Terach's conversion, when did it happen? So according to the Medrash and the Agada, Terach was the one who informed King Nimrod of Avram's abusive and blasphemous treatment of the hallowed images and idols. Later, and I don't know how long it took, or Soloveitchik says, the same Terach saw the light and realized that Avram was right. And this was a tremendous change in Terach. So what prompts Terach to act so strangely? So surely the great revolution in Terach's thinking was precipitated by doubts, soul-searching, and reappraisal. In a word, it was the transformation of a Baal Tshuva that was responsible for the decision to abandon Ur Kasdim. And when the command of Lech Lecha came and Avram began to pack his bags, he realized, Terach, to his great surprise, that, Avram realized to his great surprise that his father's bags had already been packed long before. And so now father and son, here too locked in mortal combat, it was Terach who took Avraham, mind you, to Nimrod. So they join hands and together start out on a great march towards Canaan. Ramban challenges the position taken by Ibn Ezra. And I believe the question can be easily resolved, because since Avram felt obligated to give him respect and to revere him, he made it appear to the outside and to the one who had taken initiative was not himself, but Terach. In spite of his good intentions, Terach didn't succeed. He didn't reach the destination. He had not succeeded in transforming himself totally. He still had great fears and great doubts. But what Soloveitchik is saying here is that Terach was all in. He was ready to follow Avram when he heard it. He was excited to go, and he does go. But he doesn't have enough faith to get him over the hump. He stops in Haran. Now, you want to argue, according to Ramban, why does it say, Vayikach Terach, Terach took him? So Ramban also writes elsewhere, it's on the source sheet, he also writes elsewhere that the Torah is writing it in this way to show kibud ava'im, that Avram is trying to show respect to his father by letting everyone think that Terach was the one that took him. It would be unbecoming for a son to be taking his father somewhere, especially in this age and time. So instead, the Torah is using language to show us the respect that Avram has for his father. What is it that makes Avraham so fitting to be chosen, so righteous? Look at this. Vashem Amar. Before the destruction of stone, he says, can I hide what I'm going to do to destroy stone? I need to talk to Avraham. And he'll be blessed. And look at this, Pasuk 19. Ki yidativ leman ashir tzavet banav beito achrav v'shamu derech Hashem lasot tzedakah mishpat. He says, I've singled him out, God says. Why? Because he instructs his children, ve'et beito, and his house after him, v'shamru derech Hashem. In other words, what makes Avraham so significant, what distinguishes him from others, is not necessarily that he is the most righteous person in his time. Noach, I would argue, is more righteous. But what makes him distinct is his willingness to inform the world of this divine message of righteousness and justice. And he does it where? It starts at home. It starts with his own father. So often when a child comes back, I don't know, from Israel, from a gap year, they have different viewpoints from their own parents. But Avram, who has a totally different world philosophy than his father, has enough respect to bring him along on his journey of Lech Lecha. He brings him along, and he even allows the Torah to say that it was Terach who takes him. He's so sensitive to his father. He shows so much respect for him, and he does all this work at home because leadership starts at home. Compare that to Noach, for instance. The Torah tells us that Noach's family is saved because of Noach. They weren't righteous. Noach couldn't get even his own family to really believe. They are saved in his merit. It's only after they experience the flood, after they experience themselves a divine act of God recreating the world, do we have the great people of Shem and Yafet. Ham is cursed by Noach, of course. But the great sage Shem was the Shiva of Shem and Aver. But that only comes after he experiences something personally. It doesn't happen because Noach doesn't do it at home. What makes Avraham so special and the model of true Jewish leadership, it isn't what he does for Sodom. It's not about the souls that he converts. It's not even about being the first Jew that believes. It's about what he does at home and how he treats his parents with respect, even when they might not believe the same thing that he does. And that's what makes Avram so special. And that, I think, is a tremendous lesson for us to learn, is that leadership, true Jewish leadership, it starts in our own home. It starts with ourselves. It starts with the people who live with us. It starts with our family members who maybe don't live with us. That's leadership. And showing respect, even when people have different opinions and see things differently than us, showing them respect in our pursuit of godliness, that is real leadership. So with that, we will stop here, and I will wish everyone a wonderful day, and look forward to seeing everyone real soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was very interesting.
Take care, y'all.